We're going to do a new thing here, see if it works. Essentially, the topic of this Q&A is how do investors measure startups or something like that. And so what I did was I posted, I don't know if you saw, but I posted in the forum and asked for a bunch of questions. There are hundreds of them. And so I'm going to take the ones that were upvoted a lot and then go from there. So most of this is going to be me asking Anu questions since Anu has been an investor for a long time.
That's not what she told me. She told me half of them.
I will help answer questions too. But just to get started, so the bigger, you kind of went over this earlier, but the big areas in which an investor evaluates a startup is team, metrics, which you went over just recently in the lecture, unique insight in how big the opportunity is. Are there any other areas big areas in which you evaluate?
Yeah, no, I think especially at the stage you're in, and probably for a while, even your Series A, B, it all comes down to only three things: team, product market fit, market opportunity. That's it. And so at the stage you're in, it really is probably the heaviest weight is the team. And so when it comes to the team, it's more about why are you working in this idea, right? And what unique insight do you have? Your clarity of thought on how you plan to, see this as a big opportunity. And how good are you at convincing that? Like and if an investor gives you capital, do you know what to do with it? Right? So that's pretty much it.
So in terms of team, what if I don't have experience in the thing that I'm building? Like, how are investors going to believe that I'm a legitimate person to work on this?
Yeah, it actually does not matter, to be honest. I think pretty much if you're consumer, B2B, enterprise, it doesn't. Where probably industry or domain experience helps a little bit is really healthcare and bio. I think in fintech there is slight bias maybe because building a fintech product requires some domain knowledge or at least interest and curiosity because there's a lot of regulatory and compliance, but largely no. So which is why I said your clarity of thought during your pitch to investors is what matters. How much you have thought about it and how well are you able to articulate all the nitty-gritty details of your business, is what matters. And more importantly than not, you should always assume you are teaching the investor about this space and the company. Don't assume they know it. And so they measure by how well you're teaching them. So that's really the measure.
Cool. So one of the things that investors say a lot is we want a team that moves fast. Mm-hmm. So how do they know you're moving fast?
Yeah. Well, this is at YC too. We say that you have to move really fast. Well, if you've said that, I plan to work on this idea. I've been thinking about it for the last 12 months. And I plan to, hire someone and launch a product in the next 12 months. That's clearly moving slow, right? So it's how they're measuring whether you move fast is how scrappy you are. Have you launched your MVP? How many iterations are you doing? How are things moving in the pace? And at this point, it should move really fast on a week by week basis. Would you agree?
Yes. If you're working on something people want, there's a lot of latent demand. And so you should be able to find users easily. In fact, if you don't know your first, I think that we say this a lot, but if you don't know your first 10 users, 10 to 50 users, it's potentially there's no founder market fit there. If you don't know where to even find them. And one of the things related to this, one of the things on the YC application, a lot of people apply more than once and get in, and one of the things we do look at is there's a questions like something along the lines of what progress have you made since the last application, and we read that actually. That's one of the first things I read is what are the learnings? Even if you don't have that many users yet, it's still what are the learnings you've made. Okay, local versus remote. Do you discount remote teams or how do you evaluate local versus remote, if anything?
Well, I think this really varies depending on who you ask. But I think one thing is clear, which is remote is increasingly taking off. And so it would be a remiss for anyone to say, we only focus on local and no longer remote, right? I think tools like Slack, Zoom have really made it incredible for more remote teams to function. I mean, look at GitLab, one of YC's companies, completely remote. Zapier, another amazing company, completely remote. So we don't make any differences. But it really comes down to the investors' selection. I think even from an investor standpoint, there's no ding on whether it's remote or local. It's more where they're spending their time. But again, here I would emphasize, don't do things to satisfy investor. Build the company you want. If you build a great company with lots of users, from wherever the investors are, they'll come.
All right. So this question is, I have heard constantly that investors are investing in team, not product, which we have said. How does a solo founder factor into this? Like, what is, like, the team is one person. So how do you evaluate that one person?
More often than not, it's the CEO that's talking to the investor anyway. We don't recommend that all founders are attending all investor meetings because obviously it's a lot of time, that goes on doing investor meetings versus you have real work to do. So it really comes down to the CEO's clarity of thought, and how well they are able to impress upon investor. By the way, this is not just to impress investors. The reason why this clarity of thought, I keep bringing this up, if you don't have that, how are you going to hire your first 10 people? If you can't convince your first 10 people that you're building something big and they should join you in your mission, then it's really hard to convince investors, right? And that's why investors are looking for that storytelling ability. So solo founder doesn't matter. It's the CEO's job. The CEO really needs to be good at it, and they should learn to be good at it.
Do you have any advice on how to know the clarity of thought, like the clarity of thought piece? Like, how are you doing well on that?
Yeah. So this is probably a really high bar example, but I'll say that, which is the Brex founders, Enrique and Pedro. It was the second time they were building a company, so they knew that they needed to do this. I don't know if they did this in their first time, probably not. But when they were going through YC, they actually literally iterated from a VR startup idea to Brex, right, which is corporate credit cards. And they had built fintech in the past. But both of them knew the stakes were high, at least for them, because they were dropping out of Stanford. They literally came out of Brazil to attend Stanford. They were dropping out of the university. And so they both wanted to make sure that Brex had a big opportunity. And before hiring a single person, they wrote down very clearly what Brex could be with all the products that they could build in the roadmap. Tested it for it was not a huge survey, but they just wrote it down to really understand. Built a financial model. Enrique actually attended the accounting class in Stanford because he had no idea how to build it. And he built a whole model year by year, tested the assumptions of market demand and what penetration they would need to hit for it to be at least $1 billion company. And only after they both got comfortable that there is a path, and this is worth quitting Stanford for and putting our entire life probably for the next 10, 15 years on this, they hired the first employee. That is an amazing clarity of thought, right? I'm not saying everybody should be there, but you should at least do the first exercise. If you were to convince someone to join you, more often than not at this stage, whoever you want doesn't want to join you. So what is that compelling story?
Cool. Next one's about international founders. So you've personally invested tons of money in international startups. How did those founders convince you to put that money into their company when you're not from there? Like Colombia, UK, all these other places.
Yeah, and I think this is where, I know I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it comes to those three things. And it also comes, I think the international ones we did were probably a little later stage too. So given we didn't have presence in the region and we didn't know what was really market demand, we waited for some more progress, right? So you see that in metrics, you see that in their thinking, you see that in a more fleshed out process. But even there, if it's hard to hire in San Francisco, think about how hard it is to hire there. Like there are no execs available with scale experience. So those CEOs actually have to work 10 times harder to have that clarity of thought and to convince someone from the US to move there.
Any suggestions of how to convince someone to move there?
Start doing really, really well. And if you do really well, for example, in LATAM, Rappi basically convinced a few execs. They actually have done a phenomenal job of attracting execs from the US. The execs felt it's the first time in their life they have an opportunity to make an impact in LATAM like the way they never did. And you can do that through a startup. It's really hard to do in any other setting. And so they've been able to convince execs with LATAM connection, obviously, but have been living in US and UK for many years to move back and lead teams.
Cool. For the purpose of applying to YC, we take founders from everywhere. And like Anu said, it's more about team and idea than metrics or where you're from and stuff like that. Okay. So is bootstrapping as a solo founder an instant no in your mind? Do you have advice for solo founders? So 10% of our batch from last batch were solo founders. So we definitely accept solo founders at YC. In terms of what you guys do, like, is that That doesn't seem like it.
I don't think that's a correct. But I would say this, having obviously observed a lot of YC founders, even the ones at scale, it's such a hard journey, and there are so many things that are going to go wrong. That having another co-founder, generally I've seen, has helped a lot more. Because there's someone who can give a lot more context than everyone, depending on the CEO. But if you don't have that, that's fine. But then by the B, we're looking for some senior execs, at least one or two, who are incredible that you can lean on for some portion of your business. Because if it's still all you, the main challenge after the BVC is the CEO is not scaling. And so if you're a solo founder, it just becomes harder if you don't scale.
Yeah. It's always good. I find that the good solo founders build a community around them of people to help them go through some tough times. Should I fundraise? So maybe this is a more fundamental question of what are the indicators that I should see before I take on investment or even go start fundraise?
Most companies tend to fundraise. So, but the short answer is I actually always refer to PG's post here because I love that post, which is try to be default alive and try to raise as much money as possible, as little money as possible, so you remain focused. I think it is super important and it's lost, on many people. But if you look at, the really even successful companies, everyone has done mistakes, but they'll all say the most painful time of their company's life, even in later rounds, was when they, you may have more money in the bank and you end up hiring more and then you actually delivered a lot less. So it's not that your problems magically go away, your problems become tenfold because you have people problems, a lot more people problems. So at this stage especially, I'd say raise as little money as possible and focus. Now, there is a question as to whether should you raise or not, right? Very few companies don't raise, but Zapier, for example, never raised after YC Demo Day. And I think because the business is so good, it's growing really well, they are EBITDA positive, they have very healthy margins, and often Wade would tell me this, like, I don't know what to do with my money in the bank, why will I raise more? It's a great reason not to raise, right? But if you are not in that luxurious situation, then, there is something to be said about I need capital to grow. Not necessarily for paid marketing. Please don't take this as paid marketing. This is another common mistake. But more like I need to hire more engineers. I need to hire ahead of time to build the things that I need because I know I have a business model at the end of it. So therefore, the way to think of fundraisers, if you think you have a clear path to the next milestone and you may need maybe $200, $500 or $1 million, then just raise that minimum amount, but come up with that plan very clearly. What is the money you need to hit that next milestone, and just raise that money because guess what? Your dilution matters.
That was a perfect answer. Have a plan, basically. Okay. So the next set of questions, there are a lot of questions on basically how do I fundraise without users or revenue, which is like a thinly veiled way of saying how do I trick investors, I think, into funding me when I don't know if I'm building something I want. But I will ask these questions. Okay. How are pre-launch startups measured, specifically those that are low commission but require high user volume?
Again, this comes down to the founder, but I honestly would say if you really think there is a big company to be built, why haven't you launched and why haven't you shown some traction before you go raise? Because you can easily, especially today, you can raise a few $100,000 even from friends and family and launch a company. So you should do that. Don't don't go out pitching to investors on some grand idea that you don't have a plan. It is possible these days, but I don't recommend it. I think if you have founder credibility, which is you're a second-time founder or a third-time founder, it is easier to do those things without launching. But remember, if the less traction you have and the less data you show, the smaller your cap, the smaller your valuation, the larger your dilution. So make sure that you really know that you want to build a company that is worth it and you believe that. And so raise accordingly because money will be there if you execute, right? And if you yourself see that you have enough user traction and there is something to be built. So I would say try to test it out. There are many ways to test it out these days in low cost effective ways. So do that first before you launch.
What is the best way to show some traction when looking for investment without launching? So like email lists, all these users lists, wait lists, stuff like that.
They're, this is the YC advice we give in the batch, which is, if you don't have money in the bank, you haven't raised. Yeah. So if you have users on email lists, you don't have users.
Yeah. All right. There are some, like, obviously we keep telling you guys users and revenue if that's your primary metric, revenue being like 99% of you should just use revenue. That way you get cash in the bank and that's your best type of investment. There are leading indicators to getting to revenue, but at the end of the day, it's like, that's really the only way. All right. How do investors view non-binding indications of interest / support in evaluating traction of the B2B company? So I'm guessing like non-binding LOIs or letters of support for grant applications and stuff like that. Do those even matter?
Not much. If you have traction and you have certain LOIs pending, then fine. Then they would call those LOIs and ask what's the probability of converting. But at the stage you're in, if you go in saying I have 2 LOIs, it doesn't mean much.
Yeah. And then how does an investor judge a heavy MVP that is someone with basically a long sales cycle? So a health IT company, it takes 4 to 6 months. Like maybe you need to raise money before you get your first contract. How do you show progress?
Yeah, this is very true for even enterprise infrastructure, which is why I made the point that you may have only 1 or 2 customers at the end of 24 months. That's okay. Most of these companies try to do pilots. So I usually tell, start with a pilot because the company is also probably hesitant to sign a, $500K, $1 million contract with a startup. So start with like a 4-week, 6-week pilot, show progress through that. Investors like to see that. They'll talk to that 1 or 2 customers. So if you are in the business of selling large contracts, like greater than 500K ACV, you can plan to have only like 2 to 3 customers in the first 12 to 24 months, because a lot of your time is going to go into making sure that it's really successful with that 1 or 2 customers. So it's not necessarily customer growth. It's more that one customer and how you're facing with them.
All right. So the last set of questions is on interacting with investors. All right. So how do you avoid investors when they say it's too early for us? What is the best way to handle this? How do you avoid getting responses like that? It is one of the most common things when they reject you.
I don't think you can avoid it. I think, I would take the no and not read into the no and keep moving.
Yeah. Hear the no and move on. Yeah. Is it sensible to start engaging with potential investors prior to finding product market fit, or should you just wait until you have real traction? Kind of answered this earlier.
Yeah, at this stage, I would say focus on building the product, focus on getting your first 100 users, and then, meet with angels. Would you agree?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
How do you find the perfect investors? So this person started with 30,000 on angel lists and removed a bunch of filters and then has like 1,000 left. How do they pick from the 1,000 investors?
I wish we had a answer for that. Or like
I think it's basically you contact all of them. I mean, it's like a sale. If you think about a fundraising, it's basically the same thing as a sales game. You have leads, you have conversion, you have to follow up, you have to send personal messages. I would just use whatever spreadsheets you're using for your sales game for this and just go for that.
Yeah. I would say try to avoid the investors that you don't have confidence in or if other founders have referenced that. But if that's the only rule of thumb. But otherwise you have to do exactly like what Adora mentioned, like go through it like a sales pipeline.
Yeah. This one's great for you. What are the best approaches for minority female founders to gain visibility within VCs?
I think the industry is changing a lot, so therefore it should be easier than it was before. I always had problems with the warm intro because most VCs say you need a warm intro, and I'm like, okay, as a female founder, you probably know less than 1% of the people who know the VCs because they're all males, and it's really hard to get a warm intro, right? I think that it's changing a lot. There are lots of, first of all, most VC firms are appointing female investors, so it's easier to get. There's groups like All Raise that really help female founders to get in front of VCs. But this is a common advice I give, irrespective of whether you're from a minority represented group or not. The best referrals is through existing portfolio founders, period. There is no compensation for that. So if you can find an existing portfolio founder of that firm and he or she is, knows you quite well and is willing to refer you, that's the best referral.
In fact, investors often actively ask their portfolio company founders, who should I meet with? And that's like one of their primary channels. Okay, 2 more questions. Just one more question. which was like a common one. How do investors come up with the valuations?
Yes. When I first started in VC, before YC, I thought there was a lot of science to it, but it's actually art. It's not science. So the truth is, until you're about CDC or so, there is no science to it. So it literally comes down to what's the stage you're at and what ownership does the VC want. So this is why if you have no traction, someone might say, I want 30% of your company, right? It's not very common in the US, but it's very common internationally. And so you end up raising 1 million at 1 divided by 0.3, literally, that's your valuation. And so I would say if you're in the US, at seed, it could vary anywhere from 10 to 15%, depending on the traction. Series A is 25% ownership. So if you're raising 10 million, 10 divided by 0.25 is the valuation. If you're Series B, it's 10% ownership. So if you're raising 30 million, 30 divided by 0.10 is the valuation. So that's why it's art. There's no science to it. Science really kicks in after the C because your growth stage and you have a lot more numbers. Plus, at that point, the growth investor is really evaluating you as to when can you go public and what would be the valuation that you go public. And so the valuation from the CDC is back calculated based on that.
Cool. So it sounds like two things, dilution to target and supply and demand. So if you're a hot company, you can say, I'm only going to sell 10%. And
Correct.
So here's my valuation. Or if you're not, then
exactly
the investors calculate that for you. All right. So that's it. 3 questions. Yes, right there.
My question is specific to your presentation. We haven't seen very many grand exits and some of the big numbers that we've seen from other industries. In your opinion, is there still appetite from investors for moonshot ideas, and especially in early education?
Of course. Look at Lambda School, another YC portfolio company of ours. So I think it's important that, I think historically, investors probably struggled with education startups because they found it tough to scale. Right, and if you don't scale, there is a cap at which it stops or it plateaus. And I think with new tools like Slack and Zoom, especially Lambda School has been able to scale really well. And also the newer edtech startups are more outcome focused. So I do expect a lot more startups in edtech. Yeah, go ahead.
So for finding investors, like how much traction should you have for going to, like, let's say you're at the pilot stage, you're piloting your software for people, but you don't have revenue, or should you wait until you have revenue?
Yeah, so the question is, how much revenue or usage should I have before I go reach out to investors? So I'm not sure that that's a good... I think it's basically...
The goal of running the company is not to go get an investor,
Yeah.
right? So that's just the whole premise of the question is the problem that I have, right? Is like, oh, what do I have to do to get this guy to like me, right? And the whole thing is like, you're going to an investor because you're like, man, I figured something out and I need some money to make this grow a lot faster. I'm a little impatient, or I'm like, God, I figured out a bunch of stuff. And if I just had this stuff, I would be able to make this a whole lot bigger, a whole lot faster, and I'm willing to give up equity to do it, right? So sometimes you can be like, hey, look, I know more money would help me grow faster, but I'm not willing to give up the equity. And so that'd be a reason not to fundraise. So it's legitimate.
Yeah.
But it is not, what is my target? The whole question is, do you have something working so well and you figured out something that like, oh shit, an investor will go like, oh, I should get on top of this. Now, from an investor's point of view, what I'm trying to figure out is like, oh, does this founder or this company know what to do with the money I'm going to give him? I don't mean like, hey, what are the things you're going to spend the money on, right? I'm always thinking about things in terms of like my money being multiplied, just as like me as the general investor. And so I'm trying to just figure out, it's like, oh, I put this into this machine, this little startup machine, and then what is it going to be turned into? What am I going to buy ROI? And that's the way your pitch should sort of go. So it says like, oh, you know what? I figured out this plan. If I raise $1 million, that will get me to this target. It's going to get me to it'll get me to a $1 million, for example, ARR. Right? So you might be at the early seed stage. I want to raise $1 million. That will get me to this target. And so to me, ideally, that target should also be the point where it will allow you to raise the next round of funding. That's sometimes the way people think about it. I don't like people think about it too much that way, because I always want you to think about every round of funding as if it's your last, and you should treat it as such. But for the most part, it's like, oh, that would be the most convincing thing. It's like, this will buy these results. It gets my company to this stage, and therefore you will imagine that at the valuation that you are buying into, this company, you will now be able to imagine be worth a whole lot more as a result. So you are fundraising when, one, you need the money to grow. Two, you're willing to give up the equity to grow. Number three, you clearly know what is the milestone that this will get your company. Now, what you might be able to say is like, the way we know that will get us to a milestone, because that we'll spend this much on product. We know that we have to get this much sales, and we're going to have this percentage to play around with a bunch of experimentation to see if we can get the product market fit.
I think the other thing is you need to have confidence. Like, don't take people's money. It's not, I think some founders these days mix it up with it's free money, or it's just like, it's money, and if it disappears, it's going to be totally okay. Like, it's other people's money. Don't take it unless you feel confident in yourself that you can grow this business. And in most cases, like, having users and revenue already and it's growing at some pace is like good evidence. Yeah, right here.
What are the factors that you would consider when you are at early stage, whether or not you want to go to some accelerator or raise money via community?
So the question is, what do people consider when they're in the early stage? The common factors to consider an accelerator, or take angel investor. Okay.
Especially when you're at the early stage, showing signs of traction in terms of digital acquisition, and the request, like the Airbnb example, like people, how many times people are coming and searching until they find their favorite ones to book.
So I think the basics of the question is like, does a certain stage of the company dictate whether I go straight to like raising from angels, or I should like go to an accelerator or an incubator? And so, there's a complex answer to that because at YC we have a whole range. Everyone from like having a bad idea is a good team and no direction that we fund, to people who already have millions of dollars in revenue. We'll do YC core, and usually almost always it is like, if you're before Series A, YC is going to be helpful to you. That being said, we've had a handful of Series A and post-Series A companies do YC batch just to join and be a part of the community. The question, I think, has to do with like, if you need money, you probably should not be picky. Like, someone's $100,000 as good as someone else's $100,000. And so for you, if you're just like, man, I really need this to like work on this full time or like get to the next milestone, then like you should not be like, which one should I choose from my list of all my options? Right? I don't think you should think about that. If like the only people who will take you is an accelerator or an incubator in the Saskatchewan, then like, God bless you. You're doing what is necessary to like make your passion and dream happen. I have no judgments against that. Like, and if you become really great as a result of it, then that's my problem. I didn't figure out how to find you or like accept you when you applied to our program. So that's number one, is like money's for the most part money, especially at the seed stage. Second, choosing which one will be good for you is up to you. And so like, I can't speak for any other program. So I have no idea how some other programs sort of compares. But a lot of people do incubators just because for us, they're like, oh my God, I have a company. The reason why people like to do YC is like, I have a company that I like, if I joined that community, I could really sell into, or I could take advantage of that sort of network. That would be really wonderful. That's number one. Number two is just like, man, I want to raise a ton of money, and you might want to pick YC to do that because we have this demo day that works really, really incredibly. And those people who participate in our demo day tends to get a whole lot better deal. Again, I always think like there's no reason why any company should not apply to YC if you're thinking about raising money, just because it's absolutely free to apply and you have nothing to lose. And we don't knock you for applying multiple times, because we're only trying to figure out what are the reasons to fund you, not reasons not to fund you. Sorry. What?
So the problem business is, transactional, and then you should do more advertising. But the way we can become the billion-dollar company is the advertising mode. Which one should we pick? The all materials about the transaction mode.
Well, I don't know. The question is around switching business models. Like you're starting with transaction, but then you may have to monetize with advertising, and that's what it takes to build a $1 billion company. I mean, I think it's the more important thing is articulating your clarity of thought around it. And so you're just saying like, hey, we've built this product. This is our initial user base. For them, we're doing transaction. You should know very clearly when you're switching, because you seem to know that, at least you asked this question before. So saying that, but this is what it takes for me to switch there, and I need X scale to get there. And that's a fine enough pitch. But I think as an investor, they're going to look at what is today and what you're doing today. That's how they look at it.
Still aligned with what you so let's say a startup has a prototype, which people build some people actually pay to the prototype, right? And now you only need about maybe $78,000 to build the first MVP or stuff. Do you feel that you should get a seed and give away 10%, or should you have to wait for that exact amount you need to build the MVP and go from there?
So I think the question is, I've got some pre-sales, or I've sold some stuff. I need an extra X $1,000 to get to my next stage of growth. Should I give up some percentage of my company to do that?
So this should I raise the 10%, which is the seed, or should I just raise the exact amount and wait for that to achieve that amount?
Well, kind of like what Anu said, I would have planned. So I need to raise X amount of dollars, and I can get to this next milestone and just raise that. Maybe you have a little bit of a buffer, like a 1 or 2 month buffer for the burn that you're going to experience. But other than that, like don't raise a ton more than you otherwise don't need, because you will be diluted. And dilution in the early rounds it's going to be struggle bus. Too much dilution in the early rounds will make it a struggle bus to raise down the road.
So basically, you say that you can basically instead of giving out 10%, you can give out 5%.
It's supply and demand, right? Like that's if you go to investors, you can ask for 5%, but this is, you just got to, it's a negotiation, right? That's not I'm definitely going to do this. It's whether they'll take it or not.
I think this might be in the case of like it's seed, right? Like it's like $20,000-$30,000 is what you need to get it finished. Okay, so for that small amount, I actually would advise you to try to get more sales. Can I get more customers who actually say like, I want this enough that I'm willing to pay for it to have it sort of built? So that's usually the advice I'd have. It seems to me for that little money, I've seen companies like max out credit cards, try to do a small business loan, et cetera. It doesn't seem to me for building the MVP that you need to give up significant equity if it's that small amount. That would be my personal recommendation to you. Like as an investor, like of course I'd be like, if I think what you're doing is promising, I will give you money for equity. But again, on your end, if there's any way that you can get to launch without, that puts you in the most favorable position when you negotiate later on. The other thing about it is, PG's written an article, essay talking about how fundraising should be done as a mode. And what that means is like fundraising is so distracting and so time consuming because it's basically a whole business model. It's like you doing B2B enterprise sales, like asking for hundreds of thousands of dollars from people. And so it takes such a long period of time. It's so much effort that it will distract away from your company. And so when you do fundraising, you should really only do it when you really need the money, and then when you can dedicate time to it, or like you're able to dedicate time to it without it sacrificing the growth of the company. That's like the ideal thing. And then immediately turn it off when it's done, like time box it and get back to work. And so you don't want to be kind of like what you see a lot of nonprofits do, where it's like I'm perpetually in a fundraising mode. I'm half like doing work on product and also trying to also collect money at the same time. It's such like a division and multitasking that is so like not favorable to your company. And so I prefer not to be like, oh, I do a little bit piecemeal here, and then a piecemeal here, and a little piecemeal here. Number one, especially if you're doing on a pre-money safe, you will not be able to track your dilution very well unless you're like being diligent about it. It's a little bit easier if you're using our default post-money safe. But like, again, it's not an ideal for your productivity and like growth for your company to like dip into fundraising just when you need it.
All right, last question. Yes.
So shifting the lens a little bit, a bunch of our customers that we're targeting are growth stage companies. and there's a lot of noise, but I like the framework that you sort of observe the metrics through. Are there other things that we should be looking at for our customers to see if they're going to be growing with us from the sort of 9 business models?
Yeah, I think if you are if your primary customer is other growth state startups, the only metric that would track whether you're growing with them is the cohorts, right? So when you look at user retention or dollar retention, I mean, this is what Stripe did, right? This is what Checker did, another YC company that sells to Uber and other ride-sharing businesses. They grew as their startups grew, so the only way you measure that is through your cohort.
I want to kind of make it clear and put this all into a framework, because you just saw a bunch of extra metrics to also track, and you're like, oh, in the Startup School program weekly update, it's only asked me for like one thing. And so how do I wrestle these two contrary ideas together? And the way you're going to do it is like, there's only one number that matters. That's going to dictate the health of your company. And so we've said it for 99% of you, it should be revenue. And for a very small percentage, it'll be something like engagement, because it's a prerequisite for you getting revenue. So advertising model is a good one for that. These other metrics that Anu has talked about, it's really about, it's like, what are the other things that are also probably correlated with success of the company, but also numbers that you should know yourself based on your business model that an investor is probably going to want to know about. There are things that will help you sound knowledgeable about your business. There's the stuff that we're going to want you to know cold. That's how we sort of evaluate founders. Like, I love founders that know their numbers. Whenever someone is like, I don't know, or I have to look something up, etc., it lets me know that as a founder, they're not constantly thinking about their company, and they're not a mastery of all the sort of variables that dictates their growth or their progress. So these other metrics helps us see into that. And so don't get obsessed about tracking all of them, et cetera. Addition, like, if you have the opportunity, you have that business model, it's going to be really great. When you go into talking investors, that's the stuff that you want to brush up on and make sure you have down cold. But ultimately, how much money is coming into the bank, or how much people are really loving your product on as frequent an active cycle as possible is going to be the best indicators for the truth of, is my company doing well, etc. Okay, this weekend, Adora and I are in Chicago. So we'll see all you guys out there. Next week, there will be not a meetup, but there is going to be a lecture on Wednesday. Thank you so much. We will mingle, and I'll see you guys next week.